Great. So if you're just joining us, we're just getting started. Here's our agenda for the evening. We're going to be talking about all things solar, and we're particularly going to dive into the Inflation Reduction Act and solar for congregations, solar installations on congregations. So we'll start with the land acknowledgement. Please take a few moments to position yourself in a position that's comfortable and reverent. This photo is from our recent Spirit of Water gathering that we had with United Theological Seminary and RISE and other partners. We there in Hidden Falls Park where we gathered to honor the water. So tonight, let's honor that wherever we are coming in from in Minnesota, we're on indigenous land. And Minnesota is located on the traditional and contemporary homelands of the Anishinaabe and Dakota peoples, the original stewards of this land. We also acknowledge the trauma that's embedded in the foundation of this country, and that the land we reside on came under control of the USA through genocide, slavery, and ongoing occupation. We recognize the historical, spiritual, and personal trauma that has impacted all of us, but especially indigenous communities, communities of color, and immigrant communities. And so by offering this acknowledgement of trauma, we affirm the right of all people to bring their whole selves and stories into this space, and we affirm our intention to promote healing, respect, and love. MNIPL is working diligently to move from a land acknowledgement to a land action. We are developing a reparations learning table, and you can find information about that on our website and more information coming out this fall about that. Tonight, presenting are myself, Buff Grace, and my colleague Bret Pence. We do most of the work on solar here at our organization. There's our emails. You can always reach us there. And you can see the slight difference in our trajectories, but we overlap a good bit, and we tend to confer a lot and work together, so we can always get you to the right answer. First, I want to just note a couple of things that we are not going to really be talking in detail about tonight. Residential solar. We think residential solar is great, and we hope lots of you and your fellow members at your congregations and faith communities explore solar for your homes. We hope you find that helpful. It can be very advantageous financially and, of course, for the climate. We partner with Solar United Neighbors. They do a great job of education and helping people navigate the residential solar arena. And co-ops are starting in October that will help you navigate that and teach you about that and find you a really good rate for your installation. You can find out more about that on our website or emailing Bret or myself. We also aren't going to be talking about community solar gardens much tonight. We think community solar gardens are a great thing. They can be a really good fit for congregations, especially congregations that have very unique architectural roofs and for whom solar installations don't work. However, there's been a lot of change in CSGs in Minnesota in just the last couple of months, and the industry, the developers, and folks like us who do outreach and education, we're still adjusting to that to know exactly what that means. But we look forward to sharing more information about that as we gather what we find to be most helpful for our congregations. We have a number of solar equity projects. One in particular is being administered by our colleague Joshua Lewis on staff at MNIPL. Joshua is a great staff person who's doing a good job of working with Cooperative Energy Futures. This is a way that low-income households can own solar at the community solar level. And there's two ways that congregations can get involved. They can door knock, help Joshua and other folks door knock to let low-income folks know about this opportunity, and or they can help sponsor the $25 join fee that allows low-income folks to actually own part of the solar array that they subscribe to. Some other solar equity projects that we have, one called Lake Street Solar, which is a really good fit for small businesses and congregations in frontline communities, especially in the Twin Cities. We have a solar equity project that we hope to roll out in the fall that will allow folks in congregations of more affluent style to invest or loan anywhere from, say, $5,000-$10,000 up to $75,000 to help frontline communities build wealth. This is a residential installation program. More information will be coming out about that. And finally, we have some solar equity projects ongoing in partnership with Solar United Neighbors, especially in outstate, to help land trust residents purchase their own household solar systems and benefit from the financial benefits of net metering and solar systems on their homes. So those are the solar equity projects that we have going on. There's lots of ways you can get involved in those. If you are a congregation that's exploring solar, and that's what we're going to start to dive into tonight, if you're exploring solar, you should, at least alongside that, or prefacing that exploration, do some work on your energy efficiency for your building. Many of you already have made some steps along those lines, and we applaud that. That's fantastic. Things like LED lighting retrofits, insulation. Maybe your HVAC system is nearing the end of its life and you want to replace it with something that is more climate sensitive. There's a lot of opportunity for improving our energy efficiency and shifting all of our energy needs from natural gas and other forms of energy over to electricity, which is the one form of energy that can be provided by renewables. So here are some things that we typically recommend. As we begin to roll out more of the IRA resources, we'll be digging into more resources for these specific actions. Okay, let's start digging into solar for your congregation. Solar basics. A solar system is a collection of solar panels installed on the roof of your facilities that produces electricity for the use in your buildings or that flows out onto the grid. A solar system is made up of solar cells, which are about the size of your hand. Those are configured into a panel, which is about the size of an interior door. And those panels are configured together in what's called an array or a system, sometimes a module. And that system is then wired in through a new type of meter, a bidirectional meter, into your building. It can be, yes, solar systems can be placed on a roof canopy over your parking lot. They can be placed on a ground mount system, but for the most part, we see most of the time they're placed on a roof because that structure already exists. The electricity that comes off the system is DC current. That's what the form of electricity we get from the sun. We use AC current in our buildings and on the grid. And so there's what's called an inverter that changes that electricity over to the correct AC current. There's three main ways that your congregation, your faith community can benefit from solar. There's integrity, protection, and savings. Maybe you've seen this quote from the UN Secretary General, Antonio Guterres. It really highlights for me in a very short phrase the stakes that we face. And many of you know about those. You are working actively in your congregations to help your congregations take meaningful action on climate so that we avoid this kind of catastrophe. I like this quote from Catherine Hayhill also that really sums it up for me. My faith is an enormous motivator for me because climate change is not just an issue that affects the entire planet. It is one that disproportionately affects those who do not have the resources to cope with this change. So it's a justice issue too. And so as you approach solar, I encourage you to draw on your values and the teachings of your faith and work with your faith leaders to examine the value of solar for your congregation that in a way that includes this integrity piece. Another value that you get is protection. And what we mean by that is you insulate yourself to some extent from the increasing volatility of carbon fuels markets. As some of you know, Xcel petitioned the PUC just recently for double their rate of increase. We see that across the country. Utilities, that are still, depending on carbon fuels, are seeing their costs rise because solar and wind are cheaper, renewable energies are cheaper. And so it's a question of, can they implement those cheaper renewable energies quickly? And they've got to bring them up to scale. So by investing in solar, you lock in your cost for electricity at today's solar rate. And then the one that's probably most familiar to folks, the value that's available to congregations, is you offset your electricity costs in what's called net metering, and you can receive a direct payment from the Inflation Reduction Act. And we're going to go into those more in depth. I'll just note that there is a third value that's out there for businesses, and that's depreciation. But depreciation is one value that can't be gained by congregations or residential homeowners.
Well, if we had a good question
yes,
in regards to the rates you were talking about
yep.
and on the protection issue, volatility, they're asking about, are we talking about the rate for electricity or the rate for natural gas, or what are we discussing when we're making that?
Yeah, that's a good question. Well, the petition to the Public Utilities Commission from Xcel was for the rates across the board. It was just a total overall rate increase of 7%. The PUC did not grant that to Xcel, in part because organizations like MNIPL and other interveners made comments to the contrary and said that that's not fair. You shouldn't do that. We don't think you've justified your reasoning for that. But so in this case, it's across the board. It was for all forms of energy that Xcel was asking for. But to the extent that electricity is generated by carbon fuels, that electricity costs more to generate than renewable energies. I mean, there's some nuance to that because of volume. Carbon fuels still can be created at volume. Carbon fuel electricity can be created in volume in some places because the infrastructure is still there or already there. But in general, renewable energies, solar and wind, are less expensive than electricity generated from carbon fuels. So the longer a utility stays on carbon fuels, the more likely your costs are to increase. And the Xcel petition is an example of how that will increase. For the last 15 to 20 years, Xcel's been increasing at 3.5% per year. They clearly want to increase at 7% per year. So that's whereas if you buy solar now, what your rate is, zero increase, because you buy in at this year's level. Hopefully that answers your question there. It's a good question. So I just want to say a note about net metering, and then we're going to go over to the Inflation Reduction Act. The net metering sounds like a big term. It's a basic concept. It simply means that all the electricity that your solar system creates, you get credit for. So no matter whether you're creating excess, such as in the summer months, or you're creating a deficit in the winter months, you get credit for every electron that's created by your system. If you create more than you need, that electricity flows out onto the grid, and the utility pays you the retail rate for that. If you create less than you need, you simply draw electricity from the grid, just as you already do right now without solar, and you pay Xcel for the electricity that you draw from the grid, and you don't pay Xcel for the electricity that comes off your solar system. So your solar system electricity is free, you don't pay for it, and you pay for any that you need over and above your solar system. You can see the little graphic there that kind of shows you going through the inverter. You know, some of it goes into your fuse box, and then you have a bi-directional meter. Some sends it out on the grid, some sends it into your building. I'm going to turn things over to Brett. Brett's going to walk us through the Inflation Reduction Act. Thanks, Brett.
Sure. Maybe before I start, we have one other question, Buff, and it was in regards to some of these to net metering and about incentives in general. And the question was, they have a solar system on their home, and they have some state or utility incentives that paid for every kilowatt hour I generated in addition to net metering. They want to know if that program is still running.
Yep, great question. We are going to mention that a little bit farther along in the presentation, but you're exactly right. Some people do have access to utility incentives, and there are, in Xcel territory, there's two basic programs. I can go into that a little bit more in depth when we get to that point.
Yeah, that's great. That's great. Thank you. And thank you all for being on this. I get to give you the most joyous news, perhaps, in talking about what sounds like a fairly humdrum bill, the Inflation Reduction Act. But it is deceiving. It should be called perhaps the Climate Reduction Act, or the maybe the first, and whatever you want to call it. It's the first attempt, the first real effort by the federal government to address climate at scale. And it's a big bill that does many different things, but the majority of the spending within the bill is for carbon reduction, to try to get the country to move faster towards clean energy and get off of fossil fuels. And there are many, many aspects to the Inflation Reduction Act, but we're honing in on congregations and solar today. So one of the most important things that it does is it modifies the investment tax credit. This is a tax credit that in the past has been the main driver of solar in the country. And is a tax rebate that if you were a business, you could get 30% back from the federal government as a tax rebate. Notably, nonprofits don't pay taxes, obviously, and thus they couldn't take part in this. And so solar was always more expensive, 30% more expensive is one way to look at it for nonprofits than it was for commercial entities. Thanks to our Senator Tina Smith, she really honed in on this. She wasn't the only one, but she was quite the leader in this. And one of the big things that the Inflation Reduction Act did last August of 2022, when it passed, was to say, okay, you nonprofits, now you are in the game too. You also can take advantage of the Inflation Reduction Act through something called direct pay. And so what that means is you, a nonprofit, you put solar on your church, your faith community building, and then you make an application, kind of pre-register to the IRS later on in that year. And then the next year, when folks are filing their taxes, the IRS sends you a form based on that pre-registration. You fill that out, kind of like you would fill out a tax form, send it into them, and you get 30% back. So automatically your solar array is 30% cheaper than it was prior to this, which is, of course, a huge deal for us. And we have an immense amount of gratitude to Senator Smith and others that made this happen. So it is quite the game changer. The other thing to note is that this has been locked in for 10 years at this point. In the past, these tax credits maybe had a 2 or 3 year window, and then it had to be up for debate, up for renewal at Congress. It always did get renewed, but it was often touch and go and hard to plan in ahead. Now this is here for a solid 10 years with current legislation. So that is really fantastic. So it's called direct pay or elective pay. In the follow-up, email to this, there'll be some, additional information from the IRS that could talk a little bit more about it. Next slide, please. Oh, there you go. Thanks. This just talks a little bit more about the Inflation Reduction Act and the direct pay provision. It's also known as the investment tax credit. Significantly, it applies to other technologies. For churches, there are two things that are worth mentioning here. One is geothermal. So there are some, churches have heating systems. It's often their highest cost is to heat or cool their building over the year. And usually that is almost inevitably through fossil fuels, because that was the only means we had to do that. Geothermal is a way to do that in a large commercial building. And it would all the tax credit that I just mentioned and the ones we'll talk about in just a minute would apply to geothermal. And we have seen some churches going forward with that. It's still in the, I would say, the early stages in terms of church buildings doing that, but we have some great examples. So that's one thing to keep in mind. And then batteries now also are covered under this, again, under the same incentives, same incentive structure. That can be significant for a church. Oftentimes in the past, some churches have looked at doing that for resiliency. This is part of maybe what Buff was talking about with protection, not just protection from volatility of prices, but outages, making sure that some dedicated circuits in your church facility are still working. If the grid goes out with a grid connected array without a battery, and the grid goes out, you don't have power. A battery allows you to utilize that power that's on your roof in an outage. It also can reduce your bill. So that is something to keep in mind. And with this price reduction, with the Inflation Reduction Act, it makes it even much more viable. So, and then the third thing to really talk about, so we've had this direct pay provision, we have these different technologies, in particular batteries that congregations might want to pay attention to as they're talking about solar. But the third thing that's really happened is it's opened up other credits that can be stacked on top of this base 30% credit that we're talking about. So these additional credits could stack on top of one another. Next slide, please. Thanks. And so here you can see some of these different tax credits that can stack on top of that base credit of 30%. So you could get as high as 70% back from the federal government on this direct pay program if you qualified for the different adders that are there. I'm going to just talk about them real briefly. Next slide, please. Thank you. So what are these bonus credits? Well, the first one is for low-income communities. So this is something that you have to qualify for first based on your location. And you will get this.
Can I interrupt you just a minute, Brett?
Sure, go ahead.
I just want to make sure people know you don't have to write all this down. We will be sending out a recording and we'll be sending out these links also. So just want to, thanks, Brett.
Yeah, thank you. I wouldn't want you to do that. Yeah, we include these links in here. The links are two maps where you can see if your location jives with, matches with some of these certain credits. So on the low income credit, again, they're trying to incentivize clean energy development in low income communities. They have maps, and we'll take a look at one real briefly. If you live in a low income community, if your church is in a low income community, then this particular credit you would apply in addition to, there's a capacity cap, which means there's just a limited amount of this on an annual basis. So this is something you would look at applying for. It's 10 to 20%. 10% is what most churches would qualify for. The 20% would be for a project that's directly serving a low income community. So you could think of that as solar on a building, like a building that is housing low income folks and directly reducing their energy bills. So there are some churches that may have lodging, on site where they actually have maybe low income folks that they're housing in a halfway house or something like that. That might be a possibility for that 20%. So that's the low income one. The American made is domestic production, is basically trying to incentivize you to look at American-made solar panels and other content. If you do that, it would be an additional 10% on top of that base credit. So again, we had 10 to 20% from low income, 10%, and they're 10% from domestic content. You can see that takeaway here. A lot of these rules are still being written in terms of what they actually mean. You can write something down in terms of legislation, but it is difficult to actually get to the point of, well, what does domestic mean? And that's what the IRS, has to put some rules around. So the domestic content one is still kind of being written at this point, but that's the takeaway is if you get American-made panels, as for American steel, that looks like that would be the way to do that. And we'll have a couple test cases we're working through this year. We'll continue to learn more about that one. And then finally, the last credit is called energy community credit. This is purely based locationally, and it's the locations are on that map, and that you'll see there, and we'll talk about in a little bit. And these are places where they've had coal plants retire, or maybe a coal mine retire. They have economic hardship based on fossil fuel industry there, that and they have a high income, or excuse me, they have a high amount of unemployment in those areas, or brownfields. Can you go to the next slide? I'm going to talk about energy communities a bit more, and low income areas. So this is a map that, that link would take you to. I just want you to see, difficult, it's the purple areas on this map, but really all parts of the state you may not think as low income qualify for this. So yes, there are large areas which are difficult to see on this scale in Minneapolis, St. Paul. Actually, there's large concentration in Duluth, where I live. But of course, you see some of the Native American reservations up north, Red Lake and Leech Lake there, Brainerd, Pelican Rapids, Marshall, Moorhead. So there, St. Cloud, really anywhere you have urban areas where you have concentrations and rural areas where you have concentrations of poverty, you have this opportunity to really get some more money back and really incentivize solar in those areas. Next slide. And then the energy communities adder, again, this is another 10%. These are areas that qualify in Minnesota this year. And you'll see that Cook County up in the north, in the Arrowhead up in the northeast section, and most of Lake County, they qualify. So they just, by virtue of where they live, they get an additional 10% back on this direct pay provision. So for them, it's instead of 30%, it's 40%. So check and see if you perhaps live in one of these areas, or folks that live in these areas, and let them know that this is something they could take advantage of. Again, this is for nonprofits. This is not on the residential side. So kind of limited to the nonprofit sector at this point, or the commercial sector. But it's an incredible opportunity for churches at this point. Again, we're looking at churches getting 50. We have a church in Duluth that looks like they may get 50% back from the federal government from the rate they put on this year. So very much worth looking into. And I will turn it back over to you, Buff.
Thanks, Brett. Just a clarification, these are federal maps, right? So this will have every state.
That's correct. The links that we included earlier, which you will get, those are federal maps. I just took a screenshot of Minnesota for our purposes here. But yes, they include all the states.
Great. And a big shout out to Janet on the call, who is on the board of a nonprofit who's already in the process of installing solar and getting this benefit. So good job. So just to recap, we've talked about the electricity cost offsets, one of the financial savings you can get, also called net metering. And then Brett just walked us through the Inflation Reduction Act and the various credits, the basic one at 30% plus the adders that you heard, extra ones that you can get. There are some other funding options that can improve your financial position with solar. One of those is what Jim was asking about earlier, utility incentives. Certain utilities, Xcel specifically, but there may be other utilities in Minnesota who do this, offer an incentive which is over and above the net metering. So this is in addition to your net metering. And there's, in the Excel territory, there's two basic tiers. There's what's called solar rewards, which is for smaller systems, 40 kilowatt DC and smaller. And then there's something called the PV rider credit, which is for larger systems. Most congregations are going to qualify for that larger credit, which is good because it's an incentive that lasts for the life of the system, or at least 25 years. The smaller credit is a smaller incentive and it lasts for 10 years. But most congregations, most houses of faith are going to fall into that second tier. And then you see the list here. I'll go through each one of these, and Brett, feel free to chime in here. So here's what I was just talking about there, the solar rewards for smaller systems and the PV rider crystal systems for larger, for Excel. You can look into Solar Moonshot. This is a national program that offers grants up to $25,000 to nonprofits. It's managed by a group called the Hammond Climate Solutions Foundation. And Brett, you told me about this. Anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, I'll just add, we've used this in Greater Minnesota because we traditionally haven't had the utility incentives available to us that that under Excel. So we are more hit or miss in terms of our utilities here, whether it be a rural co-op, municipal, or another investor-owned utility like Minnesota Power, about what incentives are available. And most often they're just not as lucrative. If there are some incentives, they're quite small. So we've used this in the past. It's a private foundation. This is part of their mission, and it's worked very well. So if you're looking for gap funding within a project, they like to figure out where your matches come in on it, but they've been nice to work with. So we recommend that as a possibility for folks.
Excellent. For some cities and municipalities around the state, you can also apply for a grant from there. They're often called cost share grants, because you have to prove that you're installing solar and going forward with a project. And they vary from city to city as to how generous the grant is. I know the Minneapolis one is pretty easy to get, and it's pretty generous. We know about many of these, and we can help you navigate that application process. For outstate folks in rural areas, you can check into the Rural Development USDA grant. This program provides guaranteed loan financing and grant funding to farmers and to small businesses that are rural in nature, and often small businesses that support farmers. So that's what that program's designed for. I think I skipped one, sorry. No, okay. And then finally, you can get creative on your own. And here's just two examples of congregations that have gotten creative with something called a carbon tax, in which members place a voluntary tax on themselves for their own carbon fuel use, such as, looks like spell check, that's not craving gasoline, that's driving a gasoline vehicle. That's kind of funny spell check problem there. Or using a natural gas appliance, or traveling by airline, or any of the types of carbon fuel use that we might do in our daily lives. And they set their own rate, and they set their own kind of style of what they're going to tax. And then they give that tax to the congregation for a specific fund to raise money for their solar system. So helps their congregation raise money for their solar system. In the case of Community of St. Martin, the first congregation I heard of doing this, they actually give the money to a environmental or climate justice organization. In the case of White Bear, Unitarian, Universalist, they're actually saving for their own solar system. So maybe that's something you want to do at your household level too. But I'm sure as many people as there are here on the call, we could come up with ideas for creative funding within our congregations towards this kind of thing. So those are the different financial savings that we've outlined. Now I want to talk about the two basic pathways that we have for helping a congregation actually get and finance solar installation. We refer to these as a direct buy, just like you buy anything, any kind of appliance. You do it with cash down or a loan. And then the second one is called a power purchase agreement, often referred to by the acronym PPA in the industry. The direct buy is, your congregation either has money, maybe from an endowment or saved up from one of these fundraising or capital campaigns type things, and you pay for the array and you get it. You receive all the benefits. So all those different values that Brett and I just went through, the congregation gets all of those. And the congregation assumes the responsibilities. So, you cover the, any insurance that might be required for cover, if perhaps the system malfunctions or something and you need some maintenance on it, not real likely, but does happen, you would pay for that. Those would be the type of responsibilities we're talking about. You can pay for it cash direct, or you can take out a loan. And there's some different loan vehicles that we can help you with. Of course, there's the standard loan. You might have a relationship, your congregation might have a relationship with a banker, maybe a denominational loaning institution, and you can get that loan at the rate you like for yourself. If you don't have that, we can help you with other options. There's something called a property assessed clean energy loan, which functions as a tax assessment. There's also capital lease options, which are, those capital lease and PACE loans don't show up on your books as a liability in the same way. So sometimes they're more beneficial for an institution than a loan. And then brand new, just out, not even quite ink dried yet, is MNCIFA, the Minnesota Climate Innovative Financial Authority. And this is a public fund overseen by a board designated by the governor. That board is still being constituted as we speak. And that will do loan guarantees, back loans, and also make loans, no interest or low interest loans to projects like nonprofits, faith communities, to help them. We helped get this law passed. Big shout out to Sarah and Juventina and Patricia who helped get this law passed. We will not know probably until early 2024 exactly what the process for applying for those funds will be, but this is a state fund, state public fund. The power purchase agreement is the second financial path, and this is a situation in which there is absolutely no cost to the congregation. The congregation pays zero, and instead you partner with an investor. This looks a lot like that option that was available for getting the tax credit that Brett went through. For that reason, PPAs are not quite as appealing to congregations now, because you can get those tax credits directly. But some congregations still want to do a PPA because some congregations just do not want to deal with a loan. And so this is a way you can still get solar without touching a loan. So it's no cost to the congregation. An investor pays for and owns the array, installs it on your building, and they get all those benefits we talked about. They assume all the responsibilities, including insurance and any kind of warranty issues or maintenance issues. And the congregation typically receives about 10% off the electricity that's produced on that array. The congregation agrees. This is where the power purchase agreement comes in. They agree to purchase that power off of that solar array, and they get to do so at a rate that's below what they would pay if they bought it from their utility. So there are buyout options available, meaning, at year 6, at year 8, at year 12, 15, somewhere along the lines of that ownership, the congregation has the option to buy that array from the investor. And usually it's at a very substantial discount over what the original cost for the system was. So that's appealing to some congregations. So I'm going to walk through some basic back of the envelope type figures for you on these two options. The first one is the congregation pays up front. So let's say you have this is taken from an actual congregation that got this proposal. You had a system over there in the green. The system is measured in DC, kilowatt DC. It's a unit of measurement that the developers use, 70.2. It costs to install this system $206,000, $100. And that's a turnkey price. It means that developer takes care of everything, all the applications, all the interconnection applications, all the product, all the labor, everything until it's turned on. You can see in that first 12 months, you would get 30% back. For some of you in those areas that Brett identified, you might get 40% back, but here's a 30% back, $61,800. And so you can see in your first 12 months, your total cost is $144,300. Then across the 25 years that you own the system and you get the benefits from it, you're going to avoid a total of $327,500 in electricity costs. So that means that over the course, if you're in Excel territory, I'm using Excel rates here, you're going to pay for the electricity you use that amount of money. Since you have a solar system that provides all your electricity, you're not going to pay that. So that's realized gain. You're also going to get that incentive payment over and above what you saved on your electricity costs. And so your total savings across the 25 years is almost $380,000. So if you look at what it costs to pay back the money you put up front, you're looking at a return on investment of about 13 years. Some churches, depending on the size of your roof and the amount of electricity you tend to use and the rate that you pay Excel, which isn't uniform across all churches, all congregations, you might get a better rate of return. You might be looking at a 10. I've seen even as good as a 7-year return on investment. I've also seen a 20-year return on investment. It really does vary across the board. So we really recommend you get an actual proposal from a developer. And of course, I'm using Excel parameters here. So these would change slightly depending on what utility serves you and what you pay for your electricity and what they pay you back for your solar installation and your solar produced. Just to point out that the proposition on that solar array continues to improve. So we used a 25-year on that back there. I used 25-year savings because solar panels are typically warranted for 25 years. That doesn't mean they stop working after 25 years. It just means that's as far as the warranty goes. So that's what we usually put our projections on. But in fact, solar systems tend to produce well after 25 years. There are panels still producing now in some systems that were installed 35 years ago. So if you add another 5 years to that savings, you add another $100,000 to your prospect there. So you can see that you just keep improving every year that you own and use the system. For Excel territory, you're making a few assumptions. One of those assumptions is that Excel is going to raise its rate 3.5% every year. They've done that for the last 15 to 20 years. They're probably going to keep doing that. You also are going to see a slight degradation in the panel's efficiency. So it's going to produce about 0.5% less electricity per year. the developers we work with use those assumptions in their modeling. And so you have that baked into the formulas that project your savings over 30 years. If you were to borrow the money for the same exact system, the 70.2 kilowatt DC system for $206,100, if you were to borrow, you're looking at a 20-year loan at 5.75%. You're subtracting from that loan payment your savings of, so your loan payment $17,300 per year. You're subtracting $15,000 in savings. So each year you're losing kind of cumulatively, you're losing about $2,300 a year by having gone solar, except that you started the first year with that federal tax credit payment to you. So you start with a $61,800 positive. So, so you're actually positive from year one, and you're losing a little bit each year net, but over the life of the system, you actually never go underwater. You're never cash negative, because your savings and that tax credit are always offsetting the cost of your loan payment. And so in this case, this congregation was able to be cash positive all the years of their ownership. Just to remind you, to mention the sample PPA finances, congregation doesn't pay a thing, doesn't cost you anything. You get a small benefit of 10% off your electricity, and the standard contract's 25 years. But we can help you discuss buying out the contract earlier if you want to own the system and begin getting that net metering and those incentive payments.
Buff, can I say one thing about that real quick?
Yeah, please.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think there is a cost to the PPA, and that's just it's not exactly a cost; it's just a reduction of benefit. So you don't get as much. You, the congregation, are not getting most of the benefits of that array. You know, that's going to the entity that owns the array, and they're giving you a small amount of that back. So it just limits the amount of the real cost of that. Is you're just not getting. Maybe the risk is lower for you, but you're not getting as much back as if you own the array yourself. Yeah, I just wanted to put that out to folks so they understood why sometimes this is a really good option for folks, because you want to limit that risk of a loan or something like that. But yeah.
Thanks, Brett. That's really important to note. I appreciate you saying that. And I note Roger's comment in the chat about Revolve. Yes, our national organization has worked with Revolve, and we think highly of them. We think they're a good outfit to work with. We have found that they tend to be most beneficial to states that don't have programs as good as Minnesota does, particularly in XL territory, with the XL having to pay retail rates for solar produced electricity. We tend to see a better setup with our developers than Revolve can provide. In other parts of the state, Revolve might be a good fit. They do kind of function as that PPA investor, although they might be a little more generous with the buyout. I realize they don't call it a buyout, but with the transfer of ownership, they might be a little bit more generous than a standard investor. Yeah. Okay, I just want to go through a couple of other things here. For you to get a no-cost proposal, you just need to send me copies of 12 consecutive months of your electric bills. We do need the actual bills. Our developer requires the actual bills because it has information that is very specific. So it can't be just an aggregate spreadsheet. It has to be the actual bills. And it's a good idea to begin talking to those in your congregation who might know about the age of the roof, what you're looking at there, because there's some different things that we can discuss, and each situation is kind of unique, but it will be helpful for you to start finding out that information about how old your roofs are, how many years before they need to be replaced. Again, in Excel territory, we can turn a proposal around in about 7 to 10 business days, present it to your leaders on Zoom, and email you the proposal document so that you have those. I know Brett can help you and has helped a lot of folks with solar. I would encourage you to email him directly, and because he's working in a variety of different locations with different developers, and it's not quite as cookie cutter as it is for us down here in the Twin Cities. This is kind of what a proposal will look like. This was for Trinity Lutheran Church. You'll get kind of a snapshot of what the basic design would look like on the roof of your faith community building. You'll see a snapshot of kind of the production in green versus the consumption in gray, and how much of your energy that system can actually offset. Just as a note, in Excel territory, that the most you can offset is 120%. You can't go above that. So this congregation was fortunate that they could build an array large enough to offset that much of their electricity. That doesn't always happen. You'll get a spreadsheet like this that lays out 30 years of exactly how much the system will produce, what that is going to save you. It identifies demand savings. It identifies any incentives if you're eligible for those incentives. It identifies the investment tax credit. If you're looking at a loan versus cash down, it'll factor the loan in. You'll get all of this, and you'll get the documents that help you analyze this and help you compare our developers offer to other developers that you might speak with. So if you wanted to go forward with this, this is a sample timeline for Excel customers. This will be similar to other parts of the state, but might be a little different. You'll sign a letter of intent. If you're buying the system, you'd pay a deposit. If it's a PPA, you're going to get that deposit back because it's going to be zero cost to you in the end. The developer will begin doing a site visit and looking exactly at what your site looks like and setting up your loan process or finding your investor if it's a PPA. We'll start applying for municipal grants if that applies to you. And the developer will begin the interconnect application for Excel territory. For other customers, it might be a little different. Then you'd sign an installation agreement once you see the actual final installation. So you don't have to go forward with the project until you know exactly that what they've modeled in the proposal is exactly what they've verified on the ground in physical reality at your site, working with your church leadership or your congregational leadership. And then they'll install the system, and then it typically takes some time for Excel to do the work that they do. They often are the longest part of the timeline. So that's Brett, you want to say anything about any differences in northern Minnesota or anything that we haven't talked about that might apply to northern Minnesota?
Yeah, I'll just build on what you kind of mentioned, that we don't have because we have so many different utilities, we have a large geographic landscape outside of the metro area. We have different electric rates in those areas, different incentives. It's just a much more cookie cutter kind of thing. So when we have worked on solar in the past in particularly in northern Minnesota where I live, we try to customize and build out. We try to get 2 or 3 bids in front of a church that wants to do that, and then kind of look through that. I think the other thing to just mention about northern Minnesota is the great excitement we all feel up here about the Inflation Reduction Act, because it's really put solar back in the game. In fact, it's been very difficult to really, churches had to self-fund or take out a really large loan over a long period of time that didn't really make the numbers balance as they were balancing in some of the other propositions here. With the Inflation Reduction Act, that changes all of that. And we also sometimes help nonprofits or even businesses because we built capacity around solar information and have relationships with contractors. So we're actually helping to put a solar array on the Whole Foods Co-op, as Buff's shown here. So we tend to work with a lot of different groups. If you live outside the metro area, you're not an Excel customer, I'm happy to try and steer you towards resources or talk you through some of the options for you. But the big message out is that the game has changed because now there's a lot of money coming back, and it just everything pencils out a lot differently. So we're seeing projects that were stalled for 4 or 5 years just starting to really roll forward now, which is great.
Excellent. Well, that is the basic presentation. I'm going to stop the recording now.